Through Other Eyes, A Story of the Black Ship Universe. Chapter 2, Part 1. The Commoner Lieutenant. During the first watch, the pilot berths were never truly quiet. There was always something, from ventilation humming through the bulkheads, distant machinery shifting mass somewhere deep in the ship, or the constant, never-ending thrum of the reactor-driven engines. Life aboard the Exalted Virtue didn't stop, it just slowed into routine, and today that routine had been disrupted. Kael lay on his bunk, one arm folded behind his head, staring up at the underside of the rack above him. The metal was scratched, worn smooth in places from years of use, the kind of surface you stopped seeing after long enough. The bunks were hot swaps, meaning that more than one person slept in them, depending on duty shift. As he overheard another pilot talking about his sisters, Senior Petty Officer Kael Rynn had no desire to remember his family, the station he grew up on, or, indeed, the entire Rynn mining outpost on the border of House Palamides and House Astor. While commoner schooling on the station had been adequate, it did little to prepare him for the Royal Academy test. Luckily, his youth shifts on the loaders allowed him to pester pilots with questions, and he had made just over the minimum required score to be accepted. There were several others from the colony on the shuttle that had carried him to the academy. 7 Rynns, 3 SEALs, and a Shacklebolt had taken the shuttle to the academy on his journey to his first day as a novice. That covered just about every commoner name on the station. Of the 11 that had made that trip, only 5 graduated 3 years later, and Kael was the only pilot. Because he wasn't sleeping, he observed his compatriots. Across the compartment, someone turned over. Another woman muttered something unintelligible in her sleep. Or maybe not asleep at all. Hard to tell anymore. The past 4 weeks had blurred everything together. Jumps, alerts, readiness cycles, rinse and repeat. Rest when you could. Eat when you can. Thinking when you shouldn't, Kael thought as he exhaled slowly through his nose. Lieutenant, the word hadn't settled easily in his mind. As a commoner, it didn't fit. Nobles lead and commoners follow. Nobles command and commoners obey. Wrapping his head around a commoner officer leads and commoners obey was threatening to give him a headache. It was just wrong. Against a lifetime of teachings, a lifetime of subservience. Above him, the rack creaked as its occupant shifted. A moment later, feet hit the deck with a dull thud as Jace Rook landed and turned to face the middle bunk. Kael didn't look over. "Are you sleeping?" Jace asked quietly. "No," Kael answered. After a pause, Jace said, "Didn't think so." The warrant officer moved across the narrow space, the soft rustle of fabric and the faint click of a locker opening cutting through the low hum of the berth. Kael turned his head just enough to watch him out of the corner of his eye. The older pilot had pulled a cup from his locker and then, entering his personal code on the dispenser, partially filled it from their libation ration. He didn't speak. Rook just stood there thinking the same as everyone else. "You believe it?" Kael asked after a while. Rook didn't answer immediately, though he didn't dismiss the question either. "Doesn't matter if I believe it," he said finally. "It happened." Kael let that sit. Because that was the problem. If it were a rumor, they could ignore it. If it were a mistake, it could be corrected. But this came from the prince. There was no correcting that. "You ever heard of it before?" "A commoner being promoted to a noble rank?" Kael asked. "No." "Not even once?" queried the senior petty officer. At 32, Jace Rook had served with the 4th Fleet among several patrol and station defense postings, before a transfer to the Honor's Truth led to fighting the Arabian raiders in the 5th Fleet. When the ship had been retired and the captain honored at Royal Naval Command in Camrim, Rook and the rest of the commoners from Honor's Truth had been transferred to the 10th Fleet. Due to his combat and service record, Warrant Officer Jace Rook was assigned to the heavy cruiser Exalted Virtue. "No," Rook said again, taking a slow drink, eyes fixed somewhere past the far bulkhead. That settled that. Kael stared back up at the ceiling. So it wasn't just rare, it was non-existent. Until now. A faint murmur carried from the far end of the berthing compartment. Not loud enough to make out words, but enough to tell the difference between normal noise and something else. Clusters of small conversations in low voices. And no one laughed, which is what usually occurred in those clusters on first watch in the commoner pilot's berthing. Kael pushed himself up onto his elbows, glancing across the compartment, noting that most of the pilots were awake. While the first watch was technically morning on the Exalted Virtue, of the 12 men and women in the berth, far more second and third watch pilots were awake than should have been at this time of the watch. 2 sat on the edges of their bunks, leaning forward, elbows on knees in hushed conversation across the walkway from each other. 3 shuttle pilots were at the table in the middle of the berth. a seasoned man and woman sitting on the benches to one side, while a younger pilot sat on the other. Another 3 Raptor pilots stood in a loose group near the hatch to the communal lavatory, talking just quietly enough not to draw attention, while Rook stood leaning against the lockers on the bulkhead across from Kael. Only the woman that had murmured in her sleep earlier and the man in the bunk directly below his appeared to be sleeping. Every conversation circled the same subject, and Kael didn't need to hear any of them to know what they were talking about. "They're going to start picking it apart," Rook said as he finished the drink and wiped the cup out with a disposable cloth. Kael looked back at him. "They already are." "Not like this." Rook shifted his weight slightly, arms folding across his chest. "They'll run every angle. How he did it, why him, who saw it, who signed the records of it, and what they can do to get it to happen to them." Kael gave a short, humorless breath. "And when they run out of angles?" "They won't," as Rook met his gaze. That wasn't comforting. Kael swung his legs over the side of the bunk, his feet hitting the deck quietly. The metal was cold on his soles, colder than it should have been. Or maybe that was just him. "You think Command knew what this would do?" he asked. Rook didn't hesitate. Yes, maybe the Prince didn't, but the commanders did. Even as Blue Bloods, flag officers are not stupid. Kael frowned. "Then why—" "Because the Prince commanded it," snapped the older man. "So Command needed their reasoning." That stopped Kael Rynn cold, and the senior petty officer took a long, proper look at Jace Rook. Needed what? Rook's expression didn't change. A story. Again, in Kael's mind, the word hung there. "Lieutenant, both simple and wrong. He's not a story. He's a pilot." Kael shook his head slightly. "A commoner pilot." "He was a pilot," Rook corrected as the silence stretched between them. It was Kael that looked away first. Across the pilot's berth, the younger shuttle pilot, a freshly transferred pilot 3rd class that had been assigned to the Exalted Virtue just before Astoria, maybe 2 years since he last wore novice gray, was talking too fast. His hands moved as he tried to explain something to the others seated at the little table. They weren't arguing. They were listening, and somehow that was worse. "You think it'll spread?" Kael asked. Rook followed his gaze. "It already has." Kael knew that, but he had meant something else. "Outside the ship." Rook was quiet for a moment. "Then, if it does, it won't spread the way you think." "What does that mean?" Kael frowned. "It won't be a commoner got promoted," Rook said. "It'll be the Prince rewards loyalty, or the Prince breaks tradition in war, something that fits." "After all, loyalty is its own reward," Rook said, his voice trailing off at the end. Kael let out a slow breath. So the system would survive. The story would be adjusted, reframed, and controlled. But down here, down where the common man lived— He looked around the barracks again. That wasn't what was happening. "Not yet. Someone's going to test it," Kael said quietly. Rook didn't ask what he meant because he didn't need to. "Yeah," he said. "And it's not going to go well." The chestnut-haired man rubbed a hand over his head and down his face, fatigue pressing in harder now that he'd stopped moving. 4 weeks of running. Astoria fell and the entire Ravensall system under the control of Duke Draymore somewhere behind them. Draymore's fleets are still out there hunting. And now this. Jace Rook stood there for a moment longer, then moved back toward his bunk. "Get some rest, Kael," the warrant officer said. "I have a feeling ours is going to be a long watch." "Yeah." Kael gave a faint, tired huff. He sat, then lay back down again and returned to staring up at the same scratched metal above him. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. Across the barracks, the murmurs didn't stop, and they wouldn't. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not until something gave. Kael closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Only the same thought, circling over and over. It was possible. And that meant sooner or later someone was going to try to be promoted like Staples had been. Finally, sleep took him. When he woke, the morning of the 3rd watch didn't feel like morning. It felt like a continuation. Normally, the men and women of the 3rd watch woke towards the end of the 2nd watch, allowing them time to rise and use the gym, maintain their armor and other equipment, or to catch an early meal at the mess. Today, Kael woke hungry. He and his shaven-headed squadron mate had gone to the commoner's mess, and now they sat at the metal table with their usual dining acquaintance, Mayra Cade. Kael felt numb as he looked down at his tray, half finished in front of him, the food cooling faster than he was eating it, his ration bars untouched. Around him, the usual noise had returned, but thinner. Conversations existed, but they didn't carry. Laughter was rare, and when it came, it died quickly. Across from him, Petty Officer Cade ate with mechanical precision, eyes occasionally flicking toward the entrance. Suddenly, to his right, Ordnance Crewman Tams Vex plopped down as if the table was his. Vex was already on his second cup of the tea that passed for stimulant, his fingers drumming lightly against the table in restless rhythm as Bren Talon, the third watch auxilia corporal they had met the night before, sat, leaned back slightly, arms folded, not eating at all. Jace Rook said nothing as the two newcomers joined their table. The warrant officer rarely did, but today even his silence had weight. Keel pushed the mush of protein pap around his tray, then finally gave up and leaned back. "Did anyone sleep?" he asked. "No one could," Mayra replied without looking up, her close-cropped mousy brown hair hiding some of the small woman's face. Tam snorted. "I did," and 3 sets of eyes shifted toward him. "For like an hour," he quickly added, reminding Keel of how much he didn't like the little man. "Crewman, why are you decorating my mess table bench with your ass?" snapped Keel. "Did you receive a promotion from the prince, too?" The color drained out of Vex's face as he quickly stood and stammered, My apologies, Senior Petty Officer." Jace raised his head up to look at Keel, while the little crewman made a hasty retreat to the return racks to drop off his mug. "You're a bit on the edge today, Senior Petty Officer," said Jace as Mayra took a sip from her own mug of tea. Keel let out a loud sigh before saying, "Yeah, a bit." After a pause, he continued, "It doesn't help that I don't like that sneaky little—" His voice trailed off as he caught the expression on Jace Rook's face. Bren hadn't reacted to the situation. As he sat at the table with no food, the corporal hadn't stopped watching the entrance. Keel noticed that, and after a quick glance around the mess, saw that Bren Talon wasn't the only one preoccupied with the entryways. Subtle, but there. The lift bay and gangway entrances were receiving more glances and attention than necessary. Just then, a gangway hatch slid open and the focus was immediate, though not loud or dramatic. Heads turned, some openly, others just enough to see without being seen, as Commander Redford Kalen stepped into the mess companionway first. Tall, controlled, noble, his uniform immaculate. The kind of presence that didn't need acknowledgement to command, and it caused the chestnut-haired man to straighten slightly without thinking, even though the commander was outside the low dividing wall that separated the commoner's mess from the mess gangway and the officer's mess. Then, a second figure stepped in behind the commander, and Keel knew it was Staples before he fully saw him. Other than the lieutenant uniform, Staples didn't look any different than he had when he landed, and that was the problem. He displayed the same attentive yet relaxed posture, the same controlled movement and quiet awareness of his surroundings. If not for what Keel knew, he would have passed as just another low-born noble officer. But now, every eye in the mess tracked him. Not openly. Commoners knew better than to gawk openly. "Then it is true," Mayra said quietly. "Yes," Keel said, his eyes flicking to her, then back to Staples as the commander led him forward, though not toward the commoner entrance. Toward the officer section, Staples walked with the confidence of a man who belonged there. "He looks comfortable in that uniform," said Bren as he leaned forward slightly, voice barely above a whisper and jealousy blazing in his hazel eyes. The young corporal's jaw unclenched as he continued. "He was a warrant officer before. He is probably used to officer country." Keel didn't respond, instead flicking his eyes to Warrant Officer Jace Rook, who he had never seen enter the officer's mess. Jace didn't acknowledge the corporal's statement or Staples as he continued eating with his head down. Wyatt moved with Redford through the partition threshold with no hesitation or pause as Commander Kalen entered the hatch to the command mess. Unlike the commoner and officer mess sections, the command section was sealed behind a hatch flanked by 2 auxilia. Another 2 sets of auxilia flanked the entrances to the 2 open mess sections. When Staples entered officer country, the auxilia guards at the entrance didn't stop him, didn't question him. They just let him pass. Even if they knew who he was, he belonged there. That alone was enough to silence half the room on both the noble and commoner sides. Conversation died to a quiet murmur as the new lieutenant approached the serving line and loaded up a tray. Around him, Keel could hear jealous whispers about the quality of food this commoner was now getting. He felt a stab of that jealousy as he looked down at the mushy protein pap and ration bars on his tray. Though, as Bren had said, as a commoner warrant officer, Staples would have been able to eat in the officer's mess just by right of his rank. That didn't matter now as jealousy bloomed. "Look at them!" Jace hissed, and surreptitiously nodded in the direction of officer country. Keel followed his gaze and saw what Jace was excited about. 3 officers, nobles all, had already broken formation near the serving line and were waiting. "Of course," Rook said quietly. "Of course what?" Kael didn't look at him. "This is how it starts." Wyatt stepped out of line. No one spoke to him. No one acknowledged him, but the distance around him was deliberate, like he carried something unstable and dangerous. Kael watched him take his tray filled with steak and vegetables. Actual food and not just protein stew and ration bars. Mayra Cade noticed, too. "Must be nice," she muttered. Bren didn't react as his focus was locked on the nobles. The corporal's jaw was tight, and Kael thought he could hear Bren's teeth grinding. "They're going to push him," Mayra said. Kael nodded once and said, "They have to. A commoner lieutenant. That must be driving them mad." Wyatt turned away from the line and appeared to look for a seat, and that's when it happened. The 3 nobles stepped in front of him. Not aggressively or openly hostile, just blocking him from moving forward. The mess didn't stop, but it did listen. Commoners and nobles alike. Every conversation dipped just low enough to hear. Like almost every other commoner and noble in the segregated sections of the mess, Kael leaned forward slightly. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to catch the tone. "How may I be of service?" Wyatt's voice carried. Calm, controlled, subservient. "He's playing it straight?" Kael said in disbelief, and no one at the table answered him. The noble's reply to Staples didn't need to be heard. His expression said enough. Contempt, pure and unfiltered. Kael watched Staples closely, waiting for hesitation, for tension, for anything you would expect to see from an outmatched commoner. And it didn't come. Instead, the commoner officer complied, and Kael suddenly understood what the noble had commanded. 3 barks echoed across the mess. They were deliberate, sharp, and unashamed, as if Staples was giving his entire being to meet the request of the noble. The new lieutenant had just barked like a dog. Bren froze, his face locked in absolute shock as Jace's hand stopped mid-motion in drumming the tabletop. Petty Officer Mayra Cade's fork paused inches from her tray, and a protein blob fell from it. Then Jace Rook's face assumed the thundercloud look again, and Kael blinked once, slow. Across both officers' and commoners' mess section, silence fell like an anvil. Not total, but heavy enough to feel. Then laughter from the 3 nobles. The biting, better-than-you laughter of people who have proven to themselves all commoners were beneath them, especially this commoner that had risen above his station. Kael didn't look away as the 3 nobles released Staples and went on their way, mirthfully congratulating each other on their superiority. Deep inside, Kael felt a perverse stab of pleasure at witnessing the exchange, at seeing Wyatt Staples humiliated. Mayra whispered, "What the hell was that?" Her eyes wide. "He has no pride," Bren muttered, but there was something uncertain in his voice now. Kael watched Wyatt closely and carefully because that wasn't submission, though the nobles had probably thought it was. That was controlling a situation where you were outmatched. No abasement or groveling. Staples had been subservient, then just turned and walked away. Now Staples wasn't a rumor. He wasn't a story. Lieutenant Wyatt Staples, the commoner officer, was real. Low conversation began again as Lieutenant Wyatt Staples found a seat alone at the far end of the officers' mess and started to eat. No one joined him or approached him. No one ignored him either, and every glance that should have passed over him lingered. Kael felt the pang of jealousy again, as well as the brief pleasure of witnessing the public humiliation of the new lieutenant. But Kael thought as he watched the man as he began to eat, had he been humiliated? A part of Kael had burned in shame at the barks, and the situation didn't appear to affect Staples at all. "That's enough," said Kael as he exhaled slowly through his nose and leaned back on his bench seat. He said the words quietly, and it wasn't an order, but it might as well have been. Mayra picked her fork back up. Corporal Bren Talon looked away last, snorted in disgust, stood and walked toward the lift bay. Rook didn't move at all. Eating resumed, and the mess returned to something that almost resembled normal. Almost. Kael grabbed his tray and stood. "Come," he said, and no one argued with the senior petty officer. Not even Jace Rook, who outranked him. As they moved toward the return racks, Kael didn't look back and didn't need to. He could feel it, that every commoner in that room now thought the same thing. That Lieutenant Wyatt Staples was not a rumor, not ship scuttlebutt. He was real. The remainder of Second Watch passed quickly, with Kael and Jace joining the other commoners in the commoner gym. While the warrant officer's age was jokingly referred to as advanced, and in some cases he was good-naturedly called elderly, Jace Rook was strong and went straight for the heavy weights and equipment. Kael preferred the toning exercises and light cardio, and spent almost the entire remainder of Second Watch running the treadmill, lost in his thoughts. It wasn't until Jace clapped him on the shoulder to break him out of his head that he realized he had just enough time to shower and report to the ready room for the beginning of third watch briefing with the rest of his squadron.